let's solve these collective action problems. We're going to focus on environmental collective action problems because we're talking about the environment today, but these things should work in other areas as well. So how do we solve collective action problems like in our society? Like, for example, we talked about parks. How do we get parks? If we just ask people to come together and contribute to making a park, how many parks would there be? The answer is hardly any, even though we want parks. So what do we do in a society like, say, the United States? What we do is we have a government. The government job is to solve these collective action problems. And the way they do this is by they come and collect taxes, and then they spend it on those public goods that we want. If you don't pay your taxes, then there may be some coercion behind this. But the government is the thing in charge of providing these collective action or solving the collective action problems. And so, in some cases, we could talk about maybe urging national laws to protect the environment. So, urging Brazil to do more to prevent deforestation. And then what would happen is, if they're using this sort of form, Brazil's going to arrest and fine illegal loggers. Now, here's the problem that we're actually facing right now. Why would Brazil choose to do this? Brazil, the country in general, gets economic benefits from the logging and all that sort of stuff, at least in the short term. Why would it, on behalf of the United States and the European Union, say, we'll go ahead and take a hit to our economy so that you guys can have better environment? So that's one problem with this at an international level. At a national level, in fact, when we talk about public policy, this is really what we're talking about here. But at an international level, we have to remember that there is no world government to solve collective action problems. This doesn't exist as a solution at the international level. The way we usually solve these things at the local level doesn't work internationally. So we need to find some other way to solve this problem. So another thing we could turn to is taxes or subsidies. Now, this is another messy way to do this, but again, we don't do taxes and subsidies at the international level, but the thing I do want us to focus on is what taxes and subsidies do. And if we can do this at the international level, you can solve the problem. And it's this idea of internalizing the costs of the externality. So I'm going to tell you a quick story. So I had this roommate. We lived together in a house. There was like 6 of us, and we had a roommate, and she was messy. When she would eat, she would leave her dishes in the sink. This was a problem because we were not living in the best place, and messy dishes lead to roaches, and roaches are disgusting. So, we all agreed, yeah, we'll do our dishes when we do them, and yet dishes kept ending up in the sink, and it was pretty clear it was from her. So let's just tell the story really fast. What we're looking for, the public good in this story is what? Think about that. What's the public good? It's a clean kitchen, okay? Or a clean sink or whatever. So it's this sort of element here. Now, here's the problem. To contribute to this clean kitchen, everybody has to do their dishes. Maybe you don't care that much about a clean kitchen and you don't want to spend the time doing the dishes, so the cost is really low for you and the externality is being felt by everybody else, the roaches and all that kind of stuff out there. So what you would then do, what we did in this situation is we took the dishes that she left in the sink and we put them in her bed. So now what we've done is the externality that she has the cost of the externality that she's put onto us, we have now put onto her. And so now she has a cost with this, and so she's more likely to clean the dishes up because she doesn't want to pay those costs. And this is what we do, like with pollution. Like, for example, if I own that factory that's pumping, greenhouse gases out in the atmosphere, there's no cost to me. So what we might have is the government come along and put a fine on me, and now I bear the cost of the pollution. And so I have an incentive now to clean it up. That's the whole idea here. You make it costly not to change the behavior. So one example of this is carbon emission quotas. So the way this works, and these aren't universally used. Europe uses these, but it works like this: each business is allowed to emit X amount of greenhouse gases. So based on the size of your business, things like that, you get a certain allowance that you can emit every year. Now, if you do a lot of work to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that you emit each year, you have extra left over, and you can then sell it to others who don't do that work. So now you have an incentive to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that you put out, because you can actually make money from this. And that's the idea there, is that now you have the costs of the externality of just pumping gases out or whatever is now internalized. The Kyoto Protocol, which you guys have read about, it does something like this with carbon markets, where instead of talking about each business, it says each state is allowed to emit X. And then states who need less can sell some of theirs to states who need more. And that's a way that can sort of work. So that's another way to try to solve some of these collective action problems. This is going to be the way that we usually come down on this, and that's going to be common rules. International law is one way to talk about this, but just in terms of just think common rules. And now, what I want you to think here is that I don't want you to think about the government passing laws, because remember, at the international level, we don't have that. I want you to think about 6 roommates. No roommate has authority over the others, but if we're all going to live together in this house, we have to come up with some common rules. How do you make those rules work? What this does is, you sit down, you talk with your roommates. This provides common expectations. Here's a deal breaker with us. We don't want a messy house. So there's a lot of things you can do, but don't leave a lot of messes laying around. This is something that your roommates might talk about. However, if you have a room full of like 6 guys, that might not be the big deal breaker. It might be something else. So what do the roommates think are the common expectations? And then what you need to make these rules work is there has to be a way to monitor. In other words, who is breaking the rules? You have to be able to know that. If we don't know whose dishes are being left in the sink, then how do we know who to punish for that? The other thing is enforcement. Again, when I say enforcement, I don't mean you bring the cops in. I mean that the roommates find a way to enforce this with others. Like maybe you have to put some money in a jar, or maybe you isolate that person, or maybe you shame them in some way, like you're not going to really hang out with them anymore, or you yell at them. These are all ways of enforcement that don't require sort of law and order. And what this looks like at the international level when we're talking about environment is the idea of the principles of state responsibility. In other words, in a roommate situation, everybody is responsible for the things that they do, and if they make a mess, they have to clean up their mess. That's called roommate responsibility. Same thing here. At the international level, every state is responsible for what they do. If they make a mess, they're responsible for cleaning up the mess. So it all fits into these principles like this. Duty not to injure other states. You can create environmental problems, but you have a duty not to harm other states in the midst of this. And again, think about it in terms of this idea of reciprocity. The U.S. doesn't harm Mexico because it doesn't want Mexico to harm the U.S. If we're dumping our trash into their yard, then they are going to dump their trash into our yard. So I won't dump my trash into your yard, reciprocity, and you won't dump yours into my yard. It's just that simple. The state is responsible to prevent injurious actions. So if there's a factory that's pumping, greenhouse gases going across the border and polluting your neighbor, that state is responsible for making sure that factory is not operating that direction. And then there's some other principles like due diligence, like you have to be in consultation with other states and notify other states when problems are happening. And then finally, we have this idea of strict liability. The state is responsible if it should have foreseen the injury. There's going to be accidents, blah, blah, blah. But if I leave dishes in the sink, I could foresee the injury to other people by doing that. If I have a factory that's belching smoke out and it's near the border, I can foresee that there's going to be a problem. I have a responsibility to fix that, and if I don't, I have a responsibility to pay or to compensate that other state in some way. It's really just that simple. I mean, it's not more complicated than that. Now, what's going to be the problem is that there are some things that are going to work really well with this, and some things that aren't going to work really well. So I know this is going to be a long video. I got one more slide I want to show you here. Are these examples of state responsibility? So don't write these down. Let's just talk about this for a second. So a factory dumps pollutants into a shared river. Is that a situation of state responsibility? So go back and look at that. Could the state have foreseen the injury? Is the state clearly responsible for what happened, et cetera, et cetera? The answer is yes. This is a very easy example of state responsibility. You just follow the pollutants up the river, find out where they came from. The state should not have done that. Where it's going to get trickier is where we talk about some things like this. Cancer in Europe after Chernobyl. Yes, after Chernobyl, the accident happens, radiation is going to go into Europe, and more people are going to get cancer. The problem is, how do I know that this particular person's cancer was caused by Chernobyl isotopes and not because that person was, say, smoking or something else like that, or just got cancer? It's a tougher one. And what they did in this case is essentially they said, how much change has there been in cancer rates since Chernobyl? That's probably Chernobyl there. So you have to compensate us for that, but you don't compensate the individuals in that case. But now here's where it's going to get even messier. And this is why we get to some of these things that are more difficult to solve. Still very solvable, but at this point, we're just in an intro class. Greenhouse gas level, rising sea level. So this is the Maldives right here. The Maldives is an island nation. Now you can tell, right? If the sea level goes up, you can understand how this is going to get really messy really fast along here. And it won't take that much of a sea level rise before the whole thing is gone. Who's responsible? Well, okay, more greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. Okay, which state's responsible? In other words, which state has put this who do I go to for compensation for the damages done? It's not very clear. And then we can ask another question, U.S. greenhouse gas. Is the United States responsible for these things? The answer is yes and no. Is the U.S. responsible? Of course it's responsible. How much responsibility is theirs? How much compensation is the United States? That is something that's a really hard thing to answer. So here's the bottom line. The common rules idea, we have to work harder on those for some problems. Some problems like this are easier to solve in the international community than others are. That doesn't mean they're unsolvable. That just means they're more complicated, and we have to spend a little more time and a little more thought into how you solve that roommate problem. Does that make sense? All right, so now you're going to watch, and you're going to read some stuff, and you're going to watch some stuff on the Paris Peace Agreement. And there's going to be an assignment that's going to follow from this, so pay attention to what's going on. I want you to think about, is the Paris Peace Agreement a good deal for the United States, a good deal for the world? What should be done here and why? And I want you to think about this again in the sense of the collective action problem. The United States has an incentive not to contribute to this. So how would you create a deal in which they would contribute, but also would solve the problem?